Arthur Vance abandoned his half-finished coffee and reached the estate in record time, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He found Elena standing on the wide, designer porch of the minimalist mansion, her face the color of ash as she clutched her phone with both hands. She didn't speak, only pointed upward toward the sleek, hidden panel in the hallway ceiling that led to the attic. Arthur felt the phantom weight of his 35 years as a forensic accountant pressing on his chest, a career spent finding the things people tried hardest to bury. He climbed the folding wooden ladder with a heavy, rhythmic thud, his heart hammering a frantic warning against his ribs as the stale, overheated air of the crawlspace filled his lungs. The attic was a cavern of shadows and discarded high-end luggage, but as he reached the far corner, he saw the false bookshelf that Logan had bragged about during the housewarming party. He pushed against the hidden latch, and the heavy oak unit swung inward to reveal a cramped, windowless storage nook no larger than a linen closet. Inside, huddled on a thin, stained mattress, sat a small girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her dark hair was a tangled nest of neglect, and her oversized pink shirt was smeared with dirt and old food. This was Maya, the granddaughter Arthur had been told was living with her maternal relatives in Chicago for the last 2 years. She stared at him with eyes that were far too large for her hollowed face, her tiny body trembling with a rhythmic, silent sobbing that broke the stillness of the room. Arthur felt a cold, sharp fury crystallize in his veins, the kind of professional rage he hadn't felt since auditing a corrupt offshore firm. He reached out slowly, his voice a low, soothing murmur as he promised her she was safe. As he gathered the frail, bird-like girl into his arms, he felt the vibrating pulse of her terror through her thin ribs. He carried her down the ladder, his boots hitting the hardwood floor with a sound like a gavel. Just as he reached the front door, the sharp, electronic chime of the Ring doorbell echoed through the foyer, signaling that Logan had received a motion alert on his phone 300 miles away in Aspen. Arthur Vance stood in the center of the sterile, designer living room with Maya shivering in his arms, the electronic chime of the doorbell still ringing in his ears like a distant alarm. He knew that 300 miles away in Aspen, Logan was staring at a smartphone screen, wondering why his retired father was standing in his foyer with a bundle of rags. Most fathers would have dialed their son in a frantic search for an explanation, but Arthur was not most fathers. He was a man who had spent 40 years looking for the truth buried beneath layers of professional deception. He did not call Logan. Instead, he placed Maya gently on the cloud-gray Italian leather sofa, his hands steady despite the cold fury vibrating through his marrow. He pulled his own phone from his pocket and bypassed his family contacts entirely, dialing 911 first to secure the immediate safety of the child, and then placing a second, more calculated call to a former colleague at the King County District Attorney's Office. "I am at 1840 Cedar Hill Drive," Arthur said, his voice dropping into the low, emotionless register he used when testifying in federal court. "I have found a child being held in a hidden compartment. Send a forensic unit and a medical team immediately." While he waited for the sirens to crest the hill, Arthur's professional habits took over with a cold, mechanical precision that overrode the grandfatherly urge to weep. He moved through the house like a ghost, his camera flash illuminating the grotesque contrast between the life Logan and Chloe projected and the one they forced Maya to endure. He climbed back into the attic, meticulously photographing the storage nook from every angle, capturing the single light bulb, the plastic plates with dried crusts of bread, and the lack of a single window or ventilation vent. He documented the false bookshelf's locking mechanism, his mind already categorizing it as evidence of intentional confinement. Descending back into the main house, he moved through the gleaming, open-concept rooms, capturing the jarring disparity of their lifestyle. He photographed the $3,000 espresso machine, the racks of designer clothing in the primary suite, and the high-end skincare products lining the marble vanities. There was not a single photograph of Maya on the walls, nor was there a stray crayon or a discarded doll in any of the communal spaces. To the outside world, this house was a child-free sanctuary of minimalist art and modern tech. In reality, it was a tomb with a living occupant. Arthur returned to Maya's side, kneeling on the expensive hardwood floor that felt as cold as ice beneath his joints. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, gently wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek while Elena, the cleaner, stood by the window in a state of shock, watching for the flashing lights. "It is going to be all right, little one," Arthur murmured, searching her face for any trace of the son he thought he had raised. Maya didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into him either. She sat with a terrifying, unnatural stillness, her eyes tracking his movements with the wary exhaustion of a creature that had long ago given up on being rescued. He noticed the way her skin had a translucent, sickly quality, a telltale sign of someone who had been deprived of the Pacific Northwest sun for months, if not years. He began to narrate his actions in a low, steady voice, trying to ground her in a reality that wasn't defined by four wooden walls and silence. He told her about the doctors who were coming to help in the warm bed that was waiting for her, but she only blinked at him, her expression a mask of profound confusion. The distant wail of sirens finally broke the heavy silence of the suburbs, growing louder until the red and blue lights began to dance across the white minimalist walls of the foyer. Elena rushed to the door to let the first responders in, her voice frantic as she tried to explain what she had found in the crawlspace. Two paramedics entered the room with a rolling gurney, followed closely by a uniformed officer whose eyes swept the room with professional suspicion. Arthur stood up slowly, keeping his body between the officers and the child until he could see the name on the lead paramedic's badge. He handed over his identification and gave a concise, 5-sentence summary of the discovery, omitting no detail of the hidden room or the lack of amenities. As the paramedics approached the sofa, one of them knelt down and spoke softly to the girl, asking her if she knew the man standing beside her. Maya looked up at Arthur, her brow furrowed in a way that suggested she was trying to solve a complex puzzle. She looked back at the paramedic and shook her head slowly, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. "He says he is a grandpa," she whispered, her eyes filling with a fresh, bewildered terror. "What is a grandpa?" Arthur felt his heart shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Logan had not just hidden her body, he had erased the very concept of family from her mind. Arthur Vance sat in the fluorescent silence of the Seattle Children's Hospital waiting room, his back as straight as the ledgers he had spent 40 years balancing. Across the hall, behind heavy double doors, Maya was being subjected to the cold, clinical scrutiny of a specialized pediatric intake team. Arthur had watched from the doorway as they took her vitals, his eyes narrowing at the way the nurse's expression shifted from professional detachment to visible horror. The preliminary report had been a litany of systematic failure that made Arthur's blood turn to liquid nitrogen. The doctors found a severe vitamin D deficiency, a direct result of being denied the simple mercy of daylight, and clear signs of muscle atrophy in her small legs that suggested her world had been limited to the square footage of a mattress for months. Every mark on her chart was a testament to Logan's negligence, a physical record of a father who had decided his daughter's existence was an obstacle to his own curated perfection. Arthur did not weep or pace. He simply opened his laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses like a digital predator catching a scent. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a rhythmic, mechanical certainty as he began what he privately termed the audit of betrayal. Years of forensic accounting had taught him that while people could lie with their lips and their filtered social media posts, numbers remained stubbornly, brutally honest. He began by bypassing the surface level of Logan's personal accounts and dove straight into the restricted trust fund Martha had helped establish for Maya after her mother's tragic passing 4 years ago. The trust was designed to be a fortress, a financial safety net intended to pay for Maya's education and well-being. Yet as Arthur scrolled through the transaction history, he saw the fortifications had been breached from the inside. He watched the steady stream of monthly maintenance fees being diverted into a secondary account he didn't recognize, his mind already mapping the flow of stolen capital. It was a classic embezzlement pattern, executed with the arrogant sloppiness of someone who believed they were too smart to ever be audited by their own flesh and blood. The deeper Arthur dug, the more the sterile reality of the hospital room seemed to fade, replaced by a ledger of pure greed. He cross-referenced the trust withdrawals with Logan's public lifestyle milestones, finding a sickening synchronicity between Maya's deprivation and Logan's ascent. He found a series of transfers totaling $15,000 marked as educational expenses that coincided exactly with Chloe's high-end dental veneers. He tracked a $5,000 emergency medical withdrawal that hit the bank the same day Logan posted a photo of his new designer watch collection on his lifestyle blog. Arthur's jaw tightened until the bone ached, but he kept his breathing slow and shallow, documenting every line item with the cold precision of a man preparing a hangman's knot. He wasn't just looking for money anymore. He was looking for the exact moment his son had traded his soul for a set of minimalist leather seats and a digital following of strangers. The air in the waiting room felt thin, vibrating with the unspoken crimes of a man who had built his life on the erasure of his own child. Arthur reached the bottom of the second quarter's report and paused, his cursor hovering over a single, massive transaction that stood out like a bloodstain on white marble. It was a withdrawal of $10,000, a significant chunk of the trust's remaining liquid assets, funneled out in a single wire transfer. The memo line in the bank's internal records was a masterpiece of irony, labeled simply as "Home Improvements." Arthur checked the date of the transfer, June 14th, and then pulled up a saved screenshot of Logan's social media feed from that same week. There was Logan, leaning against the hood of a charcoal gray Porsche Taycan, the Seattle skyline shimmering behind him as he bragged about the reward for hard work and discipline. The home improvement hadn't been for the house or for the child hidden in the attic. It had been the down payment for the very vehicle Logan had used to drive away to Aspen, leaving Maya in the dark. Arthur Vance had barely closed the spreadsheet on his laptop when his phone began to scream against the sterile plastic of the hospital waiting room chair. The caller identification displayed Logan's name, but Arthur did not rush to answer. He watched the device vibrate with a cold, detached curiosity, knowing that the rain alerts from the Seattle estate had finally pierced the bubble of the Aspen ski slopes. When he finally slid the bar to answer, the silence of the hospital was shattered by a cacophony of wind and muffled shouting. Logan's voice was a jagged edge of panic and entitlement, demanding to know why the security feed showed flashing lights and a forensic team entering the foyer. Behind him, Chloe's voice rose in a shrill, hysterical pitch, not asking about the welfare of a child, but screaming about the potential damage to their hardwood floors and the insane privacy violation of the police presence. Arthur remained eerily calm, his breathing slow and rhythmic as he leaned his head back against the cold wall, listening to his son unravel 300 miles away. He did not offer an explanation or a defense. He simply waited for the initial wave of noise to subside before speaking in the low, terrifyingly neutral tone of a man who had already seen the end of the balance sheet. "Maya is at Seattle Children's Hospital," Arthur said, cutting through Logan's frantic stammering with the precision of a scalpel. "She is currently being treated for malnutrition and prolonged sensory deprivation while a crime scene unit documents the hidden closet in your attic." The silence on the other end of the line was sudden and absolute, as if the air had been sucked out of the Aspen cabin. Arthur could almost hear the gears turning in Logan's mind as he scrambled to find a narrative that didn't end in handcuffs. Logan began to babble, claiming that Arthur was blowing a temporary living arrangement out of proportion and that they were merely trying to protect Maya from the distractions of the modern world. He argued that Arthur had no right to invite strangers into their private residence, and that this was a family matter that should have been handled with a quiet conversation rather than a tactical response. Arthur listened to the lies with a forensic focus, noting how Logan didn't ask if Maya was frightened or if she was going to be okay. He only asked who else had seen the storage nook and if the authorities had mentioned his name. Chloe's voice cut back in, her tone shifting from panic to a weaponized sweetness that Arthur recognized from her carefully curated online videos. She told Arthur that he was being confused and that his age was clearly making him paranoid, suggesting that if he just called off the police, they could talk about this like rational adults when they returned from their trip. She spoke as if she were addressing a difficult follower on her blog, using a patronizing warmth that made Arthur's skin crawl with a visceral disgust. When Arthur remained silent, her facade crumbled into pure, unadulterated vitriol. She accused him of trying to destroy their reputation out of spite because he felt left out of their glamorous lives, and she threatened to sue him for every penny of his retirement savings if a single photo of their home was leaked to the press. Arthur didn't argue with her, nor did he point out that he had already archived every transaction of their stolen trust money. He simply let the venom spill out of the phone, recording the sound of their true characters for the legal firestorm that was yet to come. Logan took the phone back, his voice now trembling with a dark, desperate aggression that Arthur had never heard before. He told Arthur that if he didn't walk out of that hospital and tell the social workers that this was all a grandfather's misunderstanding, he would be erased from their lives forever. He threatened to block Arthur's number, change the locks on the estate, and ensure that Arthur never saw a single member of the family again. "You are choosing a side, Dad," Logan hissed, the sound of his breathing heavy and ragged. "If you do this, I will disown you. You will die alone in that dusty apartment with your old books and your ledgers, and I won't even come to the funeral." Arthur looked down at his hands, seeing the steady, unshakable grip he held on the phone, and felt a profound sense of liberation. He didn't feel the sting of the threat because he realized that the son he loved had died years ago, replaced by a stranger who measured his worth in car payments and digital likes. The heavy double doors of the pediatric unit swung open, and a woman in a professional blazer carrying a thick manila folder stepped into the waiting room. She caught Arthur's eye and nodded solemnly, her expression signaling that the official investigation into Maya's welfare had begun. Arthur looked back at the phone, where Logan was still shouting about loyalty and the damage to the family brand. Arthur didn't give him the satisfaction of a final word or an emotional outburst. He simply pressed the red button, cutting the connection in the middle of Logan's sentence and plunging the Aspen Ski Lodge into a well-deserved silence. He stood up as the social worker approached, his mind already shifting from the emotional wreckage of his son to the meticulous preparation of the legal battle ahead. As she opened the case file, Arthur caught a glimpse of Maya's intake photo, a small, terrified girl with haunted eyes, and he knew that whatever Logan threatened to take away was nothing compared to what Arthur was about to recover. Arthur Vance watched the social worker disappear into the intensive care unit, the silence that followed his son's disconnected call feeling heavier than the noise that had preceded it. He sat back in the hard plastic chair, the hospital's artificial light glinting off his watch, a piece of machinery that felt far more reliable than the flesh and blood he had raised. As his mind retreated from the immediate clinical crisis, it drifted toward the memory of Martha, his late wife, whose intuition had always been a sharper instrument than his own logic. Martha had been a woman of soft smiles and steel convictions, and in the final months of her life, she had watched Logan's growing obsession with status and Chloe's performative vanity with a deepening, silent dread. She had once pulled Arthur aside in their kitchen, her voice barely a whisper as she confessed that she felt their son was drifting toward a shore where empathy could not follow. "Arthur," she had said, her eyes fixed on the garden they had built together, "Logan is building a life out of mirrors, and one day, he is going to realize there is nothing behind the glass but his own hunger." The memory prompted Arthur to stand, his joints creaking with a fatigue that was more than physical as he walked toward the hospital's parking garage. He drove across the rain-slicked streets of Seattle toward a private vault downtown, his mind replaying Martha's insistence on a specific legal maneuver 5 years ago that he had initially dismissed as overly cautious. She had pressured him to include a specific guardian clause when they helped Logan purchase the land for the Cedar Hill estate, a document that functioned as a dormant land trust. At the time, Arthur had laughed, telling her that Logan was their only son and such protections were for strangers, not family. But Martha, perhaps sensing the rot before the fruit had even ripened, had refused to budge, forcing Arthur to engineer a legal structure where the deed to the land remained tethered to their names until a specific set of moral and financial conditions were met. Inside the quiet, mahogany-lined walls of the bank's secure room, Arthur's hands were steady as he turned the 2 keys required to open his safe deposit box. He pulled out a thick, blue-bound folder that had remained untouched since Martha's funeral, the paper smelling faintly of lavender and dust. As he opened it, he saw her elegant, sloping signature next to his own blocky script, a final message from a woman who had known that love without boundaries was simply an invitation for tragedy. He began to read through the dense legal prose, his eyes scanning for the specific trigger events they had codified years earlier. The clause stated that in the event of documented criminal neglect or the misappropriation of family fiduciary trusts, the ownership of the land, and by extension, the right to occupy any structure built upon it, would revert entirely to the surviving original trustee. Arthur sat in the dimly lit vault, the document resting on his knees like a loaded weapon. He realized that Logan and Chloe had spent 4 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars building a modernist monument to their greed on a foundation they never truly owned. Every designer fixture, every marble countertop, and every hidden shelf in that house was legally a guest on Arthur's property, a guest that had just violated the most sacred terms of its stay. He felt a profound sense of Martha's presence in the room, a quiet, spectral approval for the accounting that was about to take place. Logan had threatened to disown him, to leave him to die alone in his apartment, but he had done so while standing on the very ground Arthur provided. It was the ultimate professional oversight, a failure to read the fine print of the life he had so arrogantly assumed was his for the taking. He stood up, tucking the blue folder under his arm with the same care he would use for a high-value forensic report. He knew that the authorities would handle the criminal charges of neglect and endangerment, but the financial and territorial reckoning would be his alone to execute. Logan and Chloe thought they were returning to Seattle to fight a messy custody battle for a child they didn't want, but Arthur was preparing to show them that they were returning to a life that had already been liquidated. He walked out of the bank and into the gray Seattle afternoon, the cold air feeling crisp and clear in his lungs. He didn't just have the digital evidence of the stolen trust or the photographs of the attic, he held the very deed to their reality. Martha had seen the storm coming 5 years before the first cloud appeared, and she had built him a fortress to weather it. Arthur Vance returned to his apartment with the weight of the land deed in his satchel, but his mind remained focused on the digital fortress Logan and Chloe had constructed to shield their vanity. He knew that while the physical evidence in the attic was damning, the court of public opinion was where Chloe lived, breathed, and extracted her primary income. She had already begun her counteroffensive from a luxury rental in Aspen, posting a series of cryptic, tear-streaked photos to her stories about family betrayals and the unseen burdens of modern motherhood. Arthur watched the engagement numbers climb on his secondary monitor, seeing the wave of supportive comments from strangers who had no idea they were comforting a woman who had caged a child in a crawlspace. He realized that a man of his generation might be expected to wait for the slow wheels of the legal system to turn, but his years as a forensic auditor had taught him that the most effective way to collapse a fraudulent entity was to cut off its cash flow before it could reorganize. He opened a secure, encrypted browser and began to assemble a package of information that he titled the Seattle Estate Disclosure. Arthur did not rely on hyperbole or emotional pleas. He simply utilized the cold, undeniable power of documentation that had served him his entire career. He selected the high-resolution photographs of the windowless storage nook, the medical intake summary highlighting Maya's severe vitamin D deficiency, and the bank records showing the $10,000 home improvement transfer used for the Porsche. He drafted a series of concise, professional emails to Chloe's primary corporate sponsors, ranging from the high-end minimalist furniture brand that provided her decor to the organic supplement company that touted her as a paragon of holistic wellness. He didn't send them as Arthur Vance, the vengeful grandfather. He sent them under a whistleblower alias, presenting the data as a due diligence report on a brand representative who had become a catastrophic liability. As the rain began to lash against his Seattle window, Arthur methodically hit send on over a dozen separate communications, watching the digital packets depart like silent torpedoes aimed at the hull of a sinking ship. He knew how these corporations operated. They were obsessed with brand safety and the optics of their associations, and there was no PR firm in the world that could spin the image of a hidden attic closet. By the time the clock on his wall struck 9, the first ripples of the digital collapse began to manifest in real time. Chloe's latest sponsored post, a video about the peace of a minimalist home, was suddenly flooded with thousands of comments as the leaked photos began to circulate through the dark corners of the local news forums. Arthur watched as the Minimalist Zen furniture brand issued a short, clinical statement on their official page, announcing that they were severing all ties with Chloe Vance effective immediately and that they had no prior knowledge of the circumstances regarding her domestic life. The speed of the disintegration was a testament to the fragile nature of a life built entirely on perception. By 11 o'clock that night, Chloe's secondary sponsors, a designer clothing line and a premium coffee brand, had scrubbed her image from their websites, their legal departments likely working through the night to trigger the morality clauses in her contracts. Arthur sat in his dimly lit study, the blue light of the screens reflecting in his glasses as he monitored the chatter on the tech forums where Logan's professional reputation was also beginning to bleed. A local investigative reporter had already picked up the thread of the whistleblower report, and the headline, Hidden Seattle, the attic secret of a local software architect, was already beginning to trend on social media. The minimalist aesthetic Logan and Chloe had used to mask their cruelty was being stripped away, revealing the jagged, ugly truth beneath the polished gray surfaces. By midnight, the silence of Arthur's apartment was broken by a frantic series of notifications from a vlogging platform. Chloe had attempted to upload an emergency statement, a desperate, 10-minute defense where she claimed the attic was a sensory-friendly play zone and that the medical reports were distorted by a bitter relative. But the platform's automated moderation system, likely triggered by the sheer volume of reports and the sensitive nature of the content, flagged the video within minutes of its upload. Arthur watched as the video frame went gray, replaced by a message stating that the content had been removed for violating community guidelines regarding child endangerment. Chloe's largest digital asset, a channel with over 400,000 subscribers that she had spent 5 years cultivating, was suddenly dark, its monetization frozen and its archives locked away. Arthur leaned back in his chair, feeling a grim satisfaction that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with the balancing of the books. Logan and Chloe had believed they were untouchable because they controlled the camera, but they had forgotten that the most dangerous witness is the one who records the things the camera isn't allowed to see. The digital empire they had used Maya's trust fund to build was now a wasteland of broken contracts and public condemnation. Arthur closed his laptop, the quiet of the room feeling earned, knowing that when Logan and Chloe finally stepped off the plane in Seattle, they wouldn't just be facing the police, they would be walking into the wreckage of a life that no longer had a single follower to defend it. The digital collapse was complete, and the stage was now set for the physical eviction that Martha's deed would finally deliver. Arthur Vance was sitting at his kitchen table, the morning light cutting through the steam of his tea, when the heavy thud of a fist against his apartment doors shattered the quiet. He did not startle or rush. He stood up with the deliberate slowness of a man who had already accounted for this variable in his calculations. When he opened the door, Logan was standing in the hallway, his designer puffer jacket wrinkled and his expensive hair matted from a sleepless flight back from Aspen. Behind him, Chloe paced like a caged animal, her phone gripped in her hand as if it were a weapon that had finally run out of ammunition. Logan didn't offer a greeting or an apology. He stepped into the foyer with a jagged, desperate aggression, demanding to know where Arthur had hidden his daughter. He shouted about parental rights and the illegality of Arthur's interference, his voice cracking with the strain of a man who felt the walls of his curated world closing in. Arthur remained perfectly still, his hands resting at his sides, watching his son with a clinical detachment that seemed to infuriate Logan more than any verbal retort ever could. Arthur stepped back to let them into the living room, but he did not offer them a seat or the comfort of a conversation. He walked over to his desk and picked up a neatly bound folder, placing it on the coffee table between them like a formal summons. "I have not hidden Maya," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the room. "She is in the custody of the state because you and your wife abandoned her in a crawlspace while you went skiing." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her eyes darting around the apartment as if she were looking for a camera to play to. She told Arthur that he was being dramatic and that the storage area was a temporary solution for a child with behavioral issues that he couldn't possibly understand. She accused him of being a bitter old man who was jealous of their success and their beautiful home, claiming that once they spoke to a judge, Arthur would be the one facing charges for kidnapping and harassment. She spoke with the practiced confidence of someone who believed that if she said a lie with enough conviction, the truth would eventually fold. Arthur didn't bother responding to her vitriol. Instead, he opened the folder to the first page of the financial spreadsheet he had painstakingly prepared. He pointed to a series of highlighted transactions totaling $64,000, all withdrawn from Maya's mother's life insurance trust over the last 18 months. He watched the color drain from Logan's face as he listed the dates and the corresponding purchases, the custom Italian cabinetry, Chloe's private club memberships, and the $10,000 down payment on the Porsche Taycan. Arthur explained, with the cold precision of a forensic auditor, that he had already provided this data to the district attorney's office as evidence of financial exploitation of a minor. Logan tried to stammer an explanation, claiming that the money was used for household overhead and that Maya benefited from living in a high-status environment. He argued that their lifestyle was a business asset that would eventually provide for Maya's future, but the words sounded hollow and pathetic even to his own ears. The air in the room grew heavy as the reality of the situation began to settle over Logan like a lead shroud. He shifted his tactics, dropping the aggression and adopting the tone of a wounded son who had been betrayed by his own father. He reminded Arthur of all the times they had spent together and asked how Arthur could choose a bureaucratic system over his own flesh and blood. He pleaded with Arthur to recant his statement, promising that they would move Maya into a proper room and that things would change immediately if Arthur would just help them fix this misunderstanding. Arthur looked at his son and saw only the wreckage of the boy he had raised, a man who viewed his daughter as a line item to be managed rather than a human being to be loved. He realized that Logan wasn't sorry for what he had done to Maya. He was only sorry that the accountant had finally checked the books and found the deficit in his soul. Arthur stood up, signaled the end of the meeting by closing the folder with a sharp, final snap. He looked Logan directly in the eye, his expression as unyielding as the Seattle bedrock. "You didn't build a brand, Logan," Arthur said, his voice cold and absolute. "You built a cage, and you put your daughter inside it so you could keep your gray walls clean." Chloe tried to interrupt, her voice rising in a final, shrill scream about their reputation and the minimalist vision they had worked so hard to achieve. Arthur ignored her, walking to the door and holding it open, his silence a more powerful eviction than any shout could have been. As Logan walked past him, his head bowed in a mixture of rage and defeat, he muttered that Arthur would regret this for the rest of his life. Arthur simply watched them go, his mind already turning back to the quiet apartment where Maya's new paint sat waiting on the table, knowing that the only thing he would ever regret was not opening that attic door sooner. Arthur Vance did not wait for the wheels of the bureaucratic system to grind toward a conclusion. He understood that a child's life was not a line item that could be left pending on a ledger. While Logan and Chloe scrambled to hire expensive defense attorneys with money they no longer legally possessed, Arthur returned to the quiet, rain-slicked neighborhood of Cedar Hill Drive. He did not go to the estate to gloat or to pace the empty rooms, but to conduct what he called the shadow investigation of the surrounding community. He visited the quiet couple 2 doors down, the Patels, who had lived on the block for over 7 years and prided themselves on their vigilance. When Arthur sat in their living room, showing them his credentials and a photo of Maya, he watched as a profound, sickening realization washed over their faces. They confessed that they had heard soft, rhythmic thumping and the faint sound of crying coming from the upper floor of the Vance residence for months. They had even approached Logan once during a neighborhood barbecue, expressing concern about the noise, but Logan had dismissed them with a practiced, charming smile, claiming they had rescued a foster dog with severe separation anxiety. The Patels were not the only ones who had been fed the narrative of the invisible dog, as Arthur soon discovered that the entire cul-de-sac had been systematically gaslit by his son's carefully managed persona. He moved from house to house with the meticulous patience of a field auditor, gathering statements from neighbors who had watched Logan and Chloe leave for gala events and weekend trips, always appearing as the perfect, child-free power couple. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher, recalled seeing a small, pale face in the circular attic window a single time in November, but she had convinced herself it was a trick of the Seattle light or a decorative mannequin Chloe was using for a vlog. Arthur recorded every testimony with the cold precision of a man building a gallows, his mind calculating the sheer number of opportunities Logan and Chloe had to choose a different path. Each forgotten observation and dismissed sound was another entry in the ledger of Maya's stolen childhood, providing the essential context of duration that the district attorney would need to elevate the charges to a first-degree felony. Arthur's most critical breakthrough came when he visited the Hendersons, whose high-definition smart doorbell pointed directly across the street toward Logan's driveway. He sat at their kitchen table, illuminated by the blue glow of their tablet as they scrolled back through months of archived motion alerts that the cloud had refused to delete. They watched hours of footage in a concentrated, grim silence, seeing Logan and Chloe come and go in their designer athletic wear, loading the Porsche with ski gear or organic groceries while the house behind them remained a silent tomb. Arthur watched for a single sign of a child's presence, a stray ball, a backpack, or even a glimpse of Maya being taken for a walk, but the footage was a desert of human warmth. For 8 consecutive months, the cameras recorded a world where Logan and Chloe lived as if they were the only 2 people in the universe, their movements a choreographed dance of vanity and self-absorption that never once included the girl in the attic. The footage provided something far more valuable than mere circumstantial evidence. It provided a time-stamped record of abandonment that could not be argued away by a clever lawyer. Arthur watched a specific clip from 3 months prior, seeing Logan and Chloe leave for a 48-hour trip to Victoria, British Columbia, while the lights in the main house were turned off by a remote automation system. He knew, from his earlier forensic sweep of the attic, that the storage nook had no independent climate control and no way for a 6-year-old child to access the kitchen or the bathroom once the false bookshelf was locked from the outside. The camera showed them returning 2 days later, laughing as they carried bags from a high-end boutique, while Maya had been sitting in total darkness just 20 feet above their heads. Arthur's jaw tightened until his teeth felt like they might crack, but he kept his eyes fixed on the screen, documenting the exact minute and second of every arrival and departure. By the time Arthur left the Hendersons' home, he had a digital timeline that mirrored the physical evidence found by the forensic unit. He had established that Maya had not been temporarily transitioned or sensory nooked for her own benefit. She had been systematically erased from the visible world to protect the brand of a woman who viewed motherhood as a messy aesthetic failure. He drove back toward the city, the weight of the flash drive in his pocket feeling like a lead weight, knowing that the DA's office was waiting for this final piece of the puzzle. The duration of imprisonment was no longer a matter of speculation or a grandfather's suspicion. It was a recorded fact, backed by the testimony of a neighborhood that was finally beginning to wake up to the monster living in their midst. Arthur pulled into his apartment complex, seeing the lights on in his unit and knowing that Maya was inside with her caregiver, finally safe in a place where the doors didn't lock from the outside. He realized that while Logan had spent his life trying to optimize his digital footprint, he had forgotten that the most dangerous thing in a forensic investigation is the data you leave behind when you think no one is watching. Arthur Vance understood that the legal system was a slow-moving beast, but financial ruin was a predator that moved with lightning speed. While the district attorney processed the digital evidence from the neighbors' doorbell cameras, Arthur returned to his study to execute the maneuver Martha had engineered 5 years prior. He pulled the blue-bound land trust folder from his desk and dialed his longtime attorney, a man who specialized in the ironclad protection of generational assets. Arthur explained that the trigger conditions of the Guardian Clause had been met with catastrophic precision, documented criminal neglect, and the systematic misappropriation of fiduciary funds. The land beneath Logan's feet was no longer his to walk on, and the modernist mansion he had built was now a trespasser on Arthur's property. Within the hour, a formal notice of reversion was drafted, a legal guillotine that would sever Logan and Chloe from the primary asset they used to project their false success. The following morning, Arthur drove to the county records office to finalize the filing, his movements deliberate and devoid of hesitation. He knew that by signing these documents, he was triggering a lien of justice that would effectively freeze the property in its tracks. Because the house had been constructed using unauthorized transfers from Maya's trust, which Arthur had already flagged as criminal profit, the entire estate was now subject to an immediate asset freeze pending a criminal investigation. This meant that Logan could not leverage the equity of the home to pay for the high-priced defense attorneys he had been calling from his Aspen cell. He couldn't sell the designer furniture or the modern art pieces to liquefy his position. He was trapped in a glass fortress that he no longer owned, surrounded by luxuries he had stolen from his own daughter. Arthur's phone buzzed with a frantic series of messages from Logan's bank manager, a woman Arthur had known for decades. She informed him that Logan had attempted to authorize a wire transfer of $50,000 to a premier criminal defense firm, but the system had automatically flagged the transaction. Arthur leaned against his car in the rain, listening as she explained that because Arthur had filed the land reversion and the forensic audit simultaneously, the bank's fraud department had placed a total hold on all of Logan's linked accounts. Logan's financial world, which he had cultivated with such arrogant disregard for the truth, was being squeezed into a singular, narrow point of accountability. He discovered that he couldn't even sell his Porsche Taycan to cover his mounting debts. The vehicle's title was tied to the very trust funds Arthur had proven were misappropriated. The financial trap was a masterpiece of forensic strategy, leaving Logan and Chloe with the outward appearance of wealth but no actual way to access it. Arthur had systematically dismantled their ability to fight back, ensuring that they would have to face the court with public defenders or whatever scraps of credit they could scrape together from friends they had spent years looking down upon. He watched the digital notifications on his laptop as Logan's credit cards began to decline one by one, a cascade of red numbers that mirrored the moral deficit of his son's life. The lifestyle brand they had built on Maya's suffering was now a liability that no bank or sponsor would touch, and the very walls of their home were closing in on them as Arthur's legal team prepared the formal eviction papers. By the time the sun began to set over the gray Seattle skyline, Arthur was back at his apartment, watching Maya as she sat at her new little table, carefully painting a picture of a large, bright yellow sun. He sat in his armchair, the weight of the day's filings finally beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He had not just frozen their bank accounts, he had frozen their ability to continue the charade of their perfect life. Logan had called him a retired old man with dusty books, but he had forgotten that those books contained the blueprints for his own destruction. Arthur reached out and placed a hand on the corner of Maya's table, feeling the solid reality of the wood, knowing that while Logan's empire was a house of cards, the foundation he was building for this girl was made of something that could never be liquidated. He looked at the painting of the sun and realized that for the first time in years, the accounting was finally beginning to make sense. The mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Seattle felt more like a courtroom than a lawyer's office as Arthur Vance sat at the far end of the table, his hands folded with the stillness of a statue. Across from him, Chloe Vance sat with her shoulders hunched, her eyes rimmed with red, looking significantly less like a polished lifestyle influencer and more like a cornered animal. Logan was not present, restricted by a preliminary no-contact order, leaving Chloe to face the deposition alone with a junior attorney who looked increasingly out of his depth. Arthur's own lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, began the questioning with a deceptive gentleness that Arthur recognized as the prelude to a total dismantling. For the first hour, Chloe attempted to maintain the facade she had practiced for years, weaving a narrative of being an overwhelmed mother who was simply trying to provide a quiet, minimalist sanctuary for a child with unspecified sensory issues. She spoke in hushed, trembling tones about the burdens of her career and the play nook they had designed to give Maya a sense of security, painting the attic closet as a therapeutic retreat rather than a cage. Arthur watched her performance through the cold lens of a man who dealt only in verifiable data, his expression unchanging even as Chloe began to dab at her eyes with a designer handkerchief. Sarah waited for Chloe to finish her practiced monologue before leaning forward and opening a laptop that faced the witness. She didn't offer a rebuttal, she simply hit play on a series of Chloe's own vlogs from the past 6 months, cross-referencing them with the time-stamped doorbell footage Arthur had recovered from the Hendersons. The room was filled with the sound of Chloe's bright, bubbly voice as she walked viewers through her morning wellness routine, sipping $50 matcha and talking about the importance of clarity and open space. On the second screen, the doorbell footage showed a split-screen reality. While Chloe was filming herself in the sun-drenched kitchen, the attic window remained dark and silent, and the smart home logs showed the false bookshelf hadn't been opened in over 18 hours. The atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to rise as Sarah played clip after clip of Chloe celebrating child-free weekends and minimalist date nights while sipping champagne on the patio. Arthur's lawyer pointed out that in over 200 hours of uploaded content, there was not a single mention of a daughter, not a stray toy in the background, and not a single moment of maternal concern. Chloe's lawyer tried to object, claiming that her online persona was a curated professional brand separate from her private life, but Sarah was relentless. She presented the forensic medical report alongside a video where Chloe touted a new organic meal prep service, asking Chloe how she could justify spending $400 a week on clean eating while Maya was suffering from severe malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies just a few feet above her head. The contrast was a visceral, sickening display of a woman who had traded her humanity for a digital aesthetic. Chloe's composure finally began to shatter under the weight of her own contradictions. The practiced, soft-spoken victim disappeared, replaced by a sharp, defensive aggression that revealed the jagged edges of her true character. She began to snap at the attorney, claiming that Arthur had sabotaged the house and that the doctors were exaggerating Maya's condition to help him steal their property. She argued that the world didn't understand the pressures of maintaining a brand, and that she and Logan had been under immense stress, trying to keep up appearances in a city as competitive as Seattle. But when Sarah presented the bank records showing the diverted trust funds, the money meant for Maya's mother's legacy being spent on Chloe's veneers and designer bags, the last of her defiance turned to ash. Chloe looked toward the door as if searching for an exit that didn't exist, her breathing becoming shallow and ragged as the forensic truth closed in on her. The final blow came when Sarah played a recording from the estate's internal security system that Arthur had bypassed weeks ago. It was a brief, chilling exchange between Logan and Chloe from the night before they left for Aspen. Logan's voice was clear, asking if they should leave the attic door unlocked just in case, but Chloe's response was immediate and cold. "No," she had said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "If she gets out, she'll ruin the shots for the new campaign. She's fine up there. She doesn't even know what she's missing." The recording hung in the air of the conference room like a death sentence. Chloe buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with a sudden, ugly sob that wasn't for the child she had caged, but for the realization that her life as an idol of perfection was over. In the silence that followed, Chloe looked up at Arthur, her eyes full of a desperate, venomous light. "It was Logan's idea," she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper of betrayal. "He told me we could keep her hidden until we could find a discreet boarding school. He said she was a reminder of a life he wanted to forget, and he didn't want her ruining our image. I just did what he asked to keep the family together." She began to babble, offering to testify against Logan if it meant she could avoid jail time, throwing her husband under the wheels of the very bus they had built together. Arthur stood up slowly, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor the only noise in the room. He didn't offer her a word of comfort or a look of pity. He simply walked out of the room, knowing that the deposition of lies had accomplished its goal. He had watched the woman who called him trash tear her own life apart, and as he stepped into the Seattle rain, he felt the first true sense of justice beginning to take hold. Arthur Vance moved through the following weeks with a quiet, focused energy that had nothing to do with the destruction of his son and everything to do with the reconstruction of his granddaughter. While the legal machinery of the state churned toward a criminal indictment, Arthur's apartment transformed from a sterile sanctuary of old books into a vibrant, cluttered workshop of recovery. He had secured temporary emergency placement, and for the first time in his life, the man who lived by the rigid certainty of numbers found himself navigating the fluid, fragile world of a traumatized child's heart. He didn't rush her or demand affection. He simply existed in the same space, a steady and predictable presence that didn't ask her to hide or apologize for her existence. He spent his mornings researching pediatric nutrition and his afternoons at a local art supply store, carefully selecting thick, textured paper and a set of professional-grade paints that felt substantial in the hand. He understood that Maya had been deprived of color and light for so long that her recovery needed to be a sensory experience, a deliberate reclamation of the world she had been denied. The apartment began to change, reflecting the slow thaw of the winter that had frozen Maya's development. Arthur set up a small oak table near the window where the afternoon sun hit the floor in a long, golden rectangle, providing the natural light that doctors had prescribed as medicine. He watched from his armchair as Maya approached the table with the wary hesitation of a stray animal, her small hands hovering over the brushes as if she expected a reprimand for touching them. Arthur didn't hover or offer forced encouragement. He simply kept his head down over his own ledgers, providing a background hum of normal, productive activity that allowed her to explore without the weight of being watched. Slowly, the first strokes of color began to appear on the white pages, jagged streaks of blue and green that eventually smoothed out into recognizable shapes. Arthur noted with a forensic ache in his chest that she initially refused to use the color gray, shunning any shade that reminded her of the windowless walls of the attic nook. He realized that his revenge against Logan and Chloe was merely a clearing of the brush, a necessary removal of the rot so that something healthy could finally grow in its place. Every time he sat with Maya and helped her learn the names of the birds that gathered on his balcony, he felt a deeper sense of accomplishment than any successful audit had ever provided. He was teaching her that the world was not a place of hidden corners and enforced silence, but a vast, noisy, and beautiful landscape where she had a permanent right of way. He hired a specialized child therapist who came to the apartment twice a week, a woman named Dr. Eris who spoke in the same measured, calm tones that Arthur used. Together, they worked to dismantle the psychological scaffolding Logan had built, the belief that being invisible was a virtue and that her needs were a burden to be managed. Arthur sat in the next room during these sessions, his hands busy with the restoration of an old wooden toy chest he had found at an estate sale, his ears tuned to the sound of Maya's voice as it grew stronger and more certain with every passing day. One evening, as the Seattle rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the glass, Arthur was preparing a simple dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables, the scent of herbs filling the warm kitchen. Maya was at her table, her face smudged with a streak of bright yellow paint, working with a concentration that mirrored Arthur's own professional focus. The television was off, the phones were silent, and for a moment, the apartment felt like a fortress of peace in a world that had tried so hard to tear them apart. Arthur walked over to check on her progress, expecting another abstract landscape or a drawing of the birds they had watched that morning. Instead, he saw a large, vibrant circle of gold that took up the entire center of the page, surrounded by smaller splashes of purple and orange that looked like a blooming garden. It was the most deliberate and confident piece she had created, a defiant explosion of light that seemed to pulse against the white paper. Maya looked up at him, her eyes no longer haunted by the hollow terror of the attic, but clear and questioning. She reached out and touched the edge of the golden circle, her finger leaving a small, yellow print on the wood of the table. "Grandpa," she said, the word finally sounding natural and solid in her mouth, "is the dark gone now?" Arthur knelt down so he was eye level with her, seeing his own reflection in her dark pupils, a man who had finally found a purpose that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. He took her small, paint-stained hand in his own weathered grip, feeling the steady, healthy beat of her pulse against his palm. "The dark is gone, Maya," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with a conviction that was absolute. "And as long as you are with me, we are going to stay in the light." Maya smiled, a real, radiant expression that broke the last of the shadows in the room, and for the first time, she leaned forward and rested her head against his shoulder. Arthur held her, the accountant of justice, finally realizing that the most valuable asset he would ever hold was the trust of a child who had finally found her way home. Arthur Vance stood in the back of the wood-paneled courtroom, a silent observer to the final collapse of the world his son had built on a foundation of lies. The criminal arraignment was a cold, efficient affair, stripped of the filters and flattering lighting that Logan and Chloe had used to mask their reality for so long. The prosecutor, a man whose voice carried the weight of 1,000 tragedies, read the formal charges into the record with a clinical lack of emotion that made the details seem even more horrific. Logan Vance and Chloe Vance were officially charged with felony child endangerment, criminal neglect, and grand larceny for the systematic theft from Maya's trust fund. As the words echoed through the room, Arthur watched the back of his son's head, noting the way Logan's shoulders remained stiff and unyielding, even as the gravity of his crimes was laid bare for the public record. There was no influencer entourage, no team of high-priced lawyers to spin the narrative, and no camera to offer a graceful exit. There was only the cold, unblinking eye of the justice system. The tech community in Seattle, once Logan's primary source of validation and status, had turned on him with a collective, digital roar of disapproval. Logan's employer, a major software firm that prided itself on its family-first corporate culture, had issued a brief, scathing press release announcing that Logan had been separated from the company effectively immediately. They cited the fundamental violation of corporate ethics and personal conduct as the primary cause for his termination, effectively blacklisting him from the industry he had spent 15 years climbing. Arthur realized that for a man like Logan, losing his title as a senior architect was a more visceral blow than the threat of a prison cell. He watched as Logan's public defender whispered into his ear, likely explaining that without his high six-figure salary, their options for a protracted defense were vanishing like mist in the Puget Sound. Chloe sat beside him, her face a mask of pale, frozen terror that no amount of designer skincare could conceal. She looked at the gallery as if searching for a friendly face, but she found only the stern, judgmental stares of the reporters and the neighborhood residents who had once been her community. Her vlogging platform had permanently suspended her account following the release of the forensic medical reports, citing a violation of the most severe tier of their community guidelines. The brand deals that had funded her luxury lifestyle had not only been canceled but were being replaced by lawsuits for breach of contract and reputational damage. She was no longer a trendsetter or an inspiration. She was a cautionary tale, a viral example of what happens when the pursuit of an aesthetic consumes the capacity for basic human empathy. Arthur did not feel a sense of triumph as he watched the proceedings. He felt only the heavy, satisfying closure of a ledger being balanced after years of missing entries. He had provided the district attorney with every document, every spreadsheet, and every doorbell recording, ensuring that there was no corner of their deception left in shadow. The judge, a woman who had seen the worst of humanity in her decades on the bench, looked at Logan and Chloe with a gaze that was as sharp as a razor. She set the bail at an amount that Arthur knew would be impossible for them to meet, given that their bank accounts were frozen and their home was under a legal lien. The minimalist lifestyle they had touted was finally a reality, but it was a minimalism of their own making, one characterized by a total lack of resources, support, or hope. As the hearing concluded, the bailiff stepped forward to take Logan and Chloe into formal custody for processing. Arthur watched as the heavy iron handcuffs were ratcheted around his son's wrists, the metallic click sounding like a final, definitive period at the end of a long, dark sentence. Logan turned his head for a brief moment, his eyes scanning the back of the room until they finally locked onto Arthur's. In that look, Arthur saw a jagged flash of the same entitlement that had driven Logan to cage his daughter, a silent, venomous accusation that his father was the one who had betrayed him. Arthur did not flinch or look away. He stood his ground with the quiet dignity of a man who had done the hardest job of his life. He watched as Logan was led through the side door and out of sight, that a software architect of a prison of greed finally being ushered into a cell of his own design. Arthur Vance stood at the wooden lectern of the King County Superior Court, the weight of a 40-year career and the shadow of his late wife, Martha, steadying his hands. The room was heavy with the scent of old paper and the cold, institutional silence of a place designed to measure the value of a human soul. In the back row, Maya sat with a court-appointed advocate, a small girl who now wore a bright yellow cardigan and held a worn stuffed rabbit Arthur had bought her. Arthur didn't look back at her. He kept his eyes fixed on Judge Sandra Miller, a woman whose reputation for steel-trap logic was surpassed only by her intolerance for those who betrayed the vulnerable. To his left, Logan and Chloe sat in their orange jumpsuits, stripped of the designer labels and filtered vanity that had defined their existence. They looked smaller now, tethered to the reality of their choices by the heavy iron of their shackles, their faces etched with the desperate realization that no apology could reconcile the deficit they had created. Arthur opened his final forensic report, but he did not speak of numbers at first. He spoke of the accountability of the soul, a concept he had debated with Martha over thousands of dinners. He told the court that as a forensic accountant, he had spent his life tracing the flow of capital, but that nothing in his professional history had prepared him for the moral bankruptcy he found in his own son's attic. He described that a storage nook not as a room, but as a deliberate erasure of a child's humanity, a space designed to be forgotten so that a curated image could thrive. He detailed the clinical findings of sensory deprivation and malnutrition, his voice remaining low and steady as he mapped the physical toll of Logan's greed onto the hollowed frame of the girl sitting in the back of the room. He explained that while a bank could be made whole through restitution, the 6 years of Maya's life that had been spent in the dark were a debt that could never be repaid with currency. The courtroom remained in a state of suspended animation as Arthur presented the final audit of the stolen trust funds, his fingers tracing the line items like a map of a betrayal. He spoke of the $64,000 funneled away from Maya's mother's legacy, detailing how every withdrawal for a luxury vacation or a designer car was a direct theft from the child's future. He showed the court that the minimalist vision Logan and Chloe had marketed to the world was funded by the blood and bone of a daughter they viewed as a liability to their brand. He didn't use words like evil or monstrous, he simply used the data, letting the cold, unyielding facts of the embezzlement speak for the character of the people who had committed it. He watched as the judge's expression grew increasingly grim, her eyes scanning the spreadsheet with the focused intensity of a person deciding the exact weight of a sentence. Arthur turned his head slightly to look at Logan, seeing the ghost of the boy he had once loved buried beneath layers of arrogance and entitlement. He told the court that Logan had threatened to disown him, to let him die alone in a dusty apartment because Arthur had dared to look behind the false bookshelf. He explained that Logan's real crime wasn't just the neglect or the theft, but the belief that his father's love was a resource to be manipulated rather than a bond to be honored. Arthur's voice finally faltered for a fraction of a second when he spoke of Maya's question about the dark, the simple, heartbreaking inquiry of a child who didn't know if the light was permanent. He concluded his statement by asking the court for the only thing that mattered, a total and permanent separation of this child from the people who had viewed her as an inconvenience to be managed. The judge did not retreat to her chambers to deliberate. She sat in the heavy silence of the room, her gaze moving between the defendants and the small girl in the yellow cardigan. When she spoke, her voice was like the strike of a hammer on an anvil, echoing with the finality of a world ending. She sentenced Logan Vance to 4 years in state prison and Chloe Vance to 2 years, citing the systematic nature of the neglect and the calculated cruelty of the financial exploitation. But the most significant part of the ruling came next, as she declared that both Logan and Chloe had fundamentally forfeited their right to be parents through their actions. She officially terminated their parental rights in their entirety, granting permanent legal custody to Arthur Vance and issuing a lifetime restraining order that prohibited any future contact with the child. The metallic crack of the gavel sounded like the closing of a tomb on the life Logan and Chloe had tried so hard to protect. Arthur watched as the bailiff stood up to lead them away, seeing Chloe's face collapse into a jagged mask of hysterical sobbing while Logan simply stared at the floor, his pride finally shattered by the absolute weight of the law. Arthur didn't wait for them to leave the room. He turned and walked toward the back of the gallery, his boots sounding loud on the polished floor. He reached Maya, who looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes, and he saw the fear beginning to dissolve into the first flickering signs of safety. He reached out and took her hand, feeling the small, steady warmth of her grip, and he knew that the accounting was finally finished. He walked out of the courtroom and into the Seattle afternoon, the rain finally stopping as a pale, weak sun began to break through the clouds, lighting the way for a grandfather and a granddaughter who finally had nothing left to hide. Arthur Vance returned to the Cedar Hill estate one final time, but he did not come as a guest or a silent observer. He came as the executor of a long overdue reckoning. The modernist mansion stood like a gray monument to vanity against the weeping Seattle sky, its sleek glass walls reflecting a world that Logan and Chloe no longer inhabited. With the land reversion finalized and the criminal sentences handed down, Arthur held the master keys in his hand, feeling the cold weight of the metal as a physical manifestation of the truth. He moved through the foyer with a rhythmic, mechanical pace, his boots echoing on the Italian marble that had been paid for with Maya's stolen trust. The house was silent, but it was a heavy, guilty silence that seemed to vibrate with the memory of the girl hidden just a few feet above. Arthur began the process of liquidation with the same forensic detachment he had used to dismantle Logan's bank accounts, moving from room to catalog the artifacts of a life built on a foundation of air. He did not keep a single piece of the minimalist aesthetic that Chloe had touted to her 400,000 digital followers. He watched as the professional auctioneers he had hired began to tag the $3,000 espresso machine, the designer leather sofas, and the curated art pieces that had never once been viewed by a child's eyes. Arthur understood that these items were not just furniture, they were the physical evidence of the trade Logan had made, swapping his daughter's sunlight for a set of high-end fixtures. He organized a massive, highly publicized estate auction, ensuring that every news outlet in the city knew exactly where the proceeds were headed. He didn't want the money for himself, and he certainly didn't want it for Maya to be associated with this house of shadows. Instead, he drafted a binding legal directive that every cent generated from the sale of the Vance assets would be donated to the Seattle Child Advocacy Center to fund the rescue of children just like Maya. As the clearing began, Arthur climbed the folding ladder to the attic for the last time, his breathing slow and shallow in the stale, dusty air. He stood before the false bookshelf, the hidden latch now broken and exposed, revealing the cramped storage nook that had been Maya's entire universe. He didn't feel rage anymore. He felt a profound, hollow sadness for the boy Logan had once been and the monster he had allowed himself to become. Arthur reached into the nook and pulled out the thin, stained mattress, dragging it across the attic floor with a harsh, scraping sound that seemed to scream in the stillness. He took the mattress and the plastic plates down to the driveway, placing them in an industrial waste bin he had ordered specifically for the purge. He wanted the house to be hollowed out, to be stripped of every trace of the people who had viewed a child as a mess to be managed rather than a life to be cherished. The removal took 3 full days, a slow-motion eviction of a lifestyle that had never truly been earned. Arthur stood on the sidewalk as the Porsche Taycan was loaded onto a flatbed trailer, its charcoal gray paint shimmering in the rain as it was hauled away to satisfy the civil judgments he had filed. He watched as the last of Chloe's designer wardrobes were packed into crates, realizing that the woman who had called him trash was now being systematically erased from the very hall she had used as a backdrop for her vanity. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains, their Ring cameras finally recording something other than a silent, childless estate. Arthur didn't wave or acknowledge them. He simply kept his eyes on the ledger in his mind, checking off each item as it departed. By the final afternoon, the house was a cavernous shell of glass and concrete, its minimalist beauty finally matching the emptiness of the souls who had designed it. Arthur walked back through the empty rooms, his footsteps sounding thin and ghostly in the vacant space. He reached the master bedroom where Chloe had filmed her wellness vlogs and saw a single, overlooked item in the corner, a small, silver-framed photo of Logan and Chloe on a beach in Maui, smiling with a radiance that looked like a lie. Arthur didn't break the glass or throw it away. He simply laid it face down on the cold floor and walked out, closing the heavy front door for the final time. He turned the deadbolt and felt that the final eviction click into place, a definitive end to a chapter that had cost more than anyone could ever pay. He walked toward his car without looking back, leaving the mansion to wait for the new owners who would hopefully fill it with the noise and chaos of a real family. As he drove away from Cedar Hill Drive, Arthur felt the ghost of Martha beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder in a silent gesture of peace, knowing that while the house was empty, their granddaughter's life was finally beginning to fill with light. Arthur Vance drove away from the gray, hollowed-out shell of the Cedar Hill estate for the last time, his eyes fixed on the road ahead rather than the rearview mirror. He had spent his entire life believing that the most important thing a man could do was balance the books, but as the rainy skyline of Seattle faded into the dense, emerald forests of the Olympic Peninsula, he realized that the only currency that truly mattered was peace. He had moved his few remaining belongings and Maya's growing collection of art supplies to a small, cedar-shingled cottage on the Washington coast, a place where the air tasted of salt and the only ring to be heard was the distant, rhythmic tolling of a buoy in the harbor. The guardian ghost of Martha seemed to walk beside him through the tall grass of their new garden, her presence no longer a warning of a coming storm, but a warm, quiet approval of the sanctuary he had built from the wreckage of their son's greed. Arthur sat on the porch in a weathered Adirondack chair, watching the mist roll off the Pacific, feeling the steady, unhurried pace of a life that no longer required a forensic audit to justify its existence. Maya was in the grass a few yards away, her bright yellow cardigan a sharp contrast against the deep greens and grays of the coastline. She wasn't painting on paper today, she was carefully arranging a circle of smooth, sea-washed stones around a patch of wildflowers, her movements deliberate and full of a quiet, focused joy. Arthur watched her with the meticulous attention of a man who finally understood the value of a miracle, noting the way her color had returned and how the haunted, hollow look in her eyes had been replaced by a spark of genuine curiosity. She looked up at him and waved, a gesture so simple and normal that it brought a lump to Arthur's throat, a physical reminder of the distance they had traveled from that windowless attic nook. He had spent 38 years documenting the failures of humanity, but in this small, salt-crusted corner of the world, he was finally witnessing its redemption. Logan and Chloe were now nothing more than names on a legal document, a closed file in the archives of a state prison system that had no use for their minimalist aesthetics or their digital followers. Arthur knew that Logan was likely sitting in a concrete cell, finally forced to live with the silence he had imposed on his own daughter, his senior architect title replaced by a 6-digit inmate number. Chloe's empire had vanished into the ether of the internet, her vanity scrubbed away by the very platforms she had used to project her false perfection. They had tried to erase Maya to protect their brand, but in the end, it was their own names that had been stricken from the record of her life. Arthur didn't feel the need to gloat or to reread the sentencing reports. The accountant of justice was satisfied that the ledger of their cruelty had been settled in full, and he had no intention of ever opening those books again. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a long, golden bridge across the water, Arthur stood up and walked down the porch steps to join Maya in the garden. He knelt beside her, his old joints complaining in a way that felt like a badge of honor, and helped her place the final stone in her circle. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder with a trust that was more valuable than all the trust funds in the world, and together they watched the tide begin its slow, inevitable crawl back toward the shore. Arthur realized that Martha had been right all those years ago. He hadn't just been building a career or a fortune, he had been building a foundation that could weather the greatest betrayal of all. He took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, the weight of the past finally dissolving into the spray of the waves. The books were balanced, the light was permanent, and for the first time in his 67 years, Arthur Vance was exactly where he was meant to be.